You're listening to Puma Podcast.
Hi, I'm Franco Luna Puma Podcast, and you're listening to Teka Teka News. In this episode,
We want ambitious actions that course correct, and the hard work has been going on for many, many months, and we know the real test starts today. Tomorrow, the World Climate Action Summit will open, where leaders will deliver decisive direction for decision on the global stocktake so that we can raise our ambition, close the gaps to 2030, and unite and act and deliver.
year after year, the international community comes together to talk about one of the most urgent issues of our time: climate change. So, what makes this year's COP28 different?
We're practically sure that this year will be the warmest year on record. We will publish the report at the COP28 in a couple of weeks, but so far it looks like we will reach the all-time high because we have just switched from La Nina to El Nino year. And besides the normal high temperatures in Pacific, we have also seen very high temperatures in the Atlantic Ocean, which is unusual.
You just heard Professor Petteri Taras. He's Secretary General of the World Meteorological Organization. He was speaking at the United Nations press conference about the WMO's Greenhouse Gas Bulletin Report ahead of the 2023 United Nations Climate Change Conference of Parties, more commonly referred to as COP28. And he says the situation is getting worse, not better.
We have shown in the report that we have again broken less comfortable records in main greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, methane and nitrous oxide. And for example, now we have 150% more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere than we had during the pre-industrial times.
That's right, 2023 will almost certainly be the hottest year on record so far. And temperatures are still going up, with Petteri saying there's no end in sight for this trend. This will mean further temperature increases and more heat waves, extreme rainfall, glacier melt and sea level rise, with disastrous consequences for people and planet. And all that becomes more evident because COP28 is taking place in the United Arab Emirates until December 12. Before we talk about reversing climate change, we should first acknowledge that greenhouse gas emissions are the main cause of climate change. As you heard, emissions are still very much rising to this day, and they need to stop rising by 2025 if we are to have any chance of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Because of this, extreme weather events like heat waves, droughts, floods, and wildfires are becoming more frequent and more intense. These events are causing widespread damage and mass displacement around the world.
The lifetime of these gases is so long that they are distributed equally worldwide. So if what is emitted in China doesn't stay in China, but it's some months it's equally distributed worldwide. The warming impact of those gases, and you can see that the carbon dioxide is responsible for 2/3 of the warming, methane a bit less than 20%, nitrous oxide 6%, and the ozone depleting gases, where we have seen luckily a drop in the emissions. They are altogether responsible for 11% of the warming potential.
Sea levels are rising because of the melting glaciers and ice sheets, which threatens coastal communities. Biodiversity is also declining at an unprecedented rate due to climate change, habitat loss, and pollution. The bottom line, as green groups have long been saying, this affects you, me, and everyone in more ways than we realize.
And this climate change is not only temperature issue, but it's wider change in our behavior of atmosphere, and practically the whole planet has seen an increase of heat waves. About half of the planet has been facing an increase of flooding events, and 1/3 of the planet has been facing an increase of drought events, and this negative trend will continue until 2060s. And of course, the impacts of climate change, they are different in different parts of the world. Here in Europe, we have seen an increase of heat waves. We have seen a dramatic increase in the melting of glaciers, and depending on year, we have seen increase of both droughts and flooding.
We're pausing for a quick break now. We'll tell you about what the international community is doing at COP28 when we return.
Because of the commitment and the dedication and the hard work of the Secretariat and the COP28 team, and how this is being met and matched by many interested parties, I am more confident than ever that we will deliver an unprecedented result. That means real solutions and real outcomes to help address this global challenge.
That's COP28 President Sultan Al Jaber speaking at a press conference after the first day of COP28. He's expressed optimism about the outcomes for the conference this year, but it's worth asking, how are we still breaking temperature records after all the agreements in the past COP sessions? Well, the short answer is inequality.
The summary is, of course, that we have these scenarios projecting a highly unequal world for the future. They are pervasive, these inequalities, across all variables. This is not just about who gets to use more fossil fuel or less fossil fuel. It's about who gets to develop and who gets to become richer and who has to remain poor. The cost of achieving high levels of mitigation is assumed to be enduring poverty in a large part of the developing world. This future that is imagined in the scenarios is coming from a large number of models that are developed in the global north.
You just heard Tejal Kanitkar. She's chairperson at the Center for Climate Change and Sustainability Studies at the Tata Institute of Social Studies in Mumbai, India. Besides the usual environmental threats we've faced for the past decades, there are a number of key issues expected to be raised at COP28. First and foremost is the irreversible and permanent harm that climate change is causing people and ecosystems around the world. There is still debate about who will contribute to the Loss and Damage Fund and who will be eligible to receive funding. To that point, developed countries have pledged to provide $100 billion per year in climate finance to developing countries. The thing is, there is a shortfall in this funding, and it's not clear how to close the gap.
It's irrefutable that we need to have a conversation on loss and damage financing. We know that in the Transitional Committee, despite the efforts of the developing countries in the Transitional Committee, the tendency is not to speak about a fund, because as you know, the decision from last year was to establish a fund and funding arrangements, but to focus on funding arrangements and understand what funding arrangements are, what it is that currently exists, what needs to be done.
That's Andres Mogro, a senior climate expert at Fundación Avina. He's been participating in high-level climate negotiations for the last 10 years. He was speaking at the UN Roundtable assessing the outcomes of COP27 and expectations for COP28. He says when the issue of funding from developed nations comes up, it usually goes like this.
Once we understand the breadth and the scenario and the entirety of funding arrangements around the world, we can discuss a fund. And that's never going to happen. I mean, it's an argument that we tend to see every time in the finance discussions that throws us into technical expert dialogues, high-level ministerial meetings throughout years and years and years. And then, like the NCQG,
that stands for New Collective Quantified Goal on Climate Finance.
We come to a year like last year, and we said we've had 4 technical expert dialogues. Let's talk about what happened in those dialogues. And there's complete lack of interest to talk about what happened in the dialogues because we're not done with the process yet. If we harvest now, we might not be as ambitious as if we harvest at the end.
The good news is this time around, the climate talks started with nearly 200 nations agreeing to launch a fund to support countries hit by global warming in a historic moment. The landmark announcement came as the oil-rich UAE declared that fossil fuels must be part of any final climate deal negotiated over the next 2 weeks.
We reached north of $420 million only in the first hour. And I know that over the next couple of days, many more pledges and many more commitments are going to be made by different heads of states and different heads of governments. And I must here say that this would not have been possible if it wasn't for the hard work and the dedication of the Transitional Committee members, Egypt, the Secretariat, and many relevant parties and stakeholders. And I also would like to thank Germany, UK, EU, US, and Japan for their pledges during the plenary earlier today.
That brings us to the biggest highlight of this year's conference, the Global Stocktake, a process of reviewing and assessing the progress that's been made on climate change. The first Global Stocktake is expected to take place at COP28. The global goal in adaptation has been set by the international community to reduce vulnerability to climate change. To this point, it's still not yet clear how this goal will be achieved. That only means that it's more than just signing covenants going forward, and maybe it's time to turn promises into action for both governments around the world and the private sector. We leave you with COP28 President Sultan Al Jaber with this food for thought for all of us living on this one earth.
We need to start thinking differently about this COP process. We can no longer only judge on ink being put on paper. We should always question how executable and how implementable and how actionable these decisions and these declarations and these agreements are. And that is what we are focused on. Our main focus is going to continue to be on translating visions and aspirations and declarations and decisions into real, practical actions that will make a difference.
And that was today's episode of Teka Teka News. Again, I'm Franco Luna. This episode was edited by Pidoy Blanco. Our Teka Teka News executive producer is Jill Caro, and our senior editor is Veronica Uy. If you found this episode useful, share it with a friend. Help Teka Teka News reach more people and keep the show going. Thanks for listening.